Hello. Hello. So I think we're going to get started. My name is Anne, and I am one of the MA Curating the Art Museum students here at the Courtauld Institute of Art. So thank you very much for coming. I know everyone's busy with deadlines and work and lots of other things. Each year, my course organizes 2 museum debates, which are essentially public discussions focusing on subjects relating to museums and to the practice of curating. During the duration of our course, which started in September, we've been to a lot of museums, and I really do mean a lot of museums. And one thing that we realized is that many of them seem to engage with mindfulness lately. And I think this is reflecting on us as a society. Our lives are getting increasingly busier. We are constantly connected and bombarded with information, which is leaving us stressed and anxious. And at the same time, we are confronted with terms like mindfulness and being well-being and mental health as well. So the question is, what is mindfulness exactly? And as you can see, I have put up a definition here on the screen by John Kabat-Zinn, who says that mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So how does this translate into the museum environment? And whether we like it or not, the art sector is picking up on the idea of mindfulness. More than 600 museums in the UK are already running programs related to mindfulness. And this includes meditation classes, yoga classes, as well as entire exhibitions organized around the subject. Why has this become so popular? And should museums be a place? I'm going to make him call out, yeah. So should museums be a place for mindfulness in the first place? And what does this say about museums' purpose today in the current political and social climate? These are some very big questions, and we invited 3 speakers to help us answer them. Our first speaker is Fiona Corridan, who's the curator of art and design at the Manchester Art Gallery, which has rebranded itself as the Museum of Mindfulness, by the way. So that's a point I think it would be worth discussing. Fiona has been involved in the exhibition And Breathe, which she has co-curated together with local mental health groups as well as primary school pupils. The exhibition explores the relationship between art, mental health, and well-being, and I've heard has been a huge success. Our second speaker is Dr. Rebekah Chamberlain, who's a lecturer in psychology at Goldsmiths. Rebekah's research sets out to understand how and why individuals create and respond so powerfully to works of art, approaching the subject from a psychological and neuroscientific point of view. She has also organized a sold-out slow-looking tour at Tate Modern's recent Pierre Bonnard exhibition. Our final speaker is Dr. Michaela Ross, who's an artist curator and visiting lecturer at King's College. Currently, she is working as a research and development lead at the Bethlem Gallery, which campaigns for access to the arts and healthcare environments and engages audiences in learning about the subject of mental health and artistic practice. This discussion will be moderated by Carolyn Sargentson, who's a former curator and then head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She is currently a visiting lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art. She's an experienced yoga teacher and works in the academic and museums and heritage sectors as a consultant, coach, and mentor. We are very excited to have you here, and please welcome me in joining our panelists.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much, Anne. And thank you to all the students who are entrusting me with facilitating the discussion this evening. We're going to begin by having 3 position statements, if you like. So each of our panellists is going to speak for a few minutes about where they're coming from. And then I'll invite the panellists to engage in a debate amongst themselves before opening up to questions from the audience. So we'll be here for around an hour, that kind of time. And then somebody from the student cohort will lead us off for refreshments. I'm not going to get in the way of the presentations or the debate just yet, so I'm going to hand straight over to Fiona to tell us about the curation of the exhibition at Manchester. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Right click. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about this exhibition And Breathe that we currently have at Manchester Art Gallery. It opened in March last year and was meant to run for a year, and then it was extended until September this year. Now it's been extended again until January 2020. So I'm hoping that's a reflection on a positive reflection on the exhibition. So, and I'll just give a little bit of feedback about the show as well as we flick through. So I'm coming at this very much from a curatorial perspective. I worked as part of a team to deliver the show. I'm not an expert in mindfulness or wellbeing. From my perspective, the exhibition was very much about wellbeing. Mindfulness is an aspect of it. Though my colleague Louise Thompson, who's our wellbeing manager, we're lucky enough to have one of those within the gallery, has spoken about Manchester Art Gallery being the Mindful Museum, which is something that Anne spoke about earlier. So the exhibition itself is an exploration of art and wellbeing, and it was a collaboration between ourselves, the Greater Manchester Mental Health Trust, Start in Manchester and Manchester Mind, and group of Year 5 and 6 school children from Charlestown Community Primary School. We decided to create the show because we're a free local authority gallery. We wanted to provide a service, a free service where people could kind of drop in, take time out of their day to reflect, to relax. We had already had programmed quite a lot of sessions that had a specific link to wellbeing or mindfulness. So we do a series of sessions called Take Notice, which look at works within the collection, and Louise runs those with mindful practitioners, and they are a kind of hour-long session in front of a specific work. And then Making Marks is another session that we do with an artist that's about drawing and mark making. But that was part of a programme that's been happening since probably about 2006 or 7. So we've been working in the realm of wellbeing, although we didn't actually call it that. You know, we've been working with different groups. We've been working with Start in Manchester for a very long time on shows with artists that have created pieces, so not non-professional artists, non-trained artists, people that have been referred to mental health services that have worked with Start, and they've created their own pieces that have then been shown in exhibitions at the gallery. There's been a huge amount of projects, but we just seem to be labelling everything as wellbeing or mindfulness now, because it has so much purchase. Obviously, at the moment, there's a lot of funding around it. We spoke about this earlier, but I feel that it's something that we've been doing for a very long time. And from my own sort of personal perspective, I used to do computer programming and was the worst computer programmer in the whole entire history of the world. And to escape, I would go to Manchester Art Gallery and look at the collection, and that was my kind of way out of the situation I was in at the time. But I didn't know what else to do. I'd always had that connection with art from my childhood, but didn't see the kind of professional route. So I've always had that kind of connection. So I feel like I've been doing this all the time, but I just haven't been articulating it in that way. So we wanted to build a space, create a space that used our collection in a really useful way. So the useful museum is the other kind of buzz term that we're using a lot at the moment, but we really wanted to find a way of working with our collections in a slightly different way that was taking the power away from the curator in some respects. We worked with different groups who came into our art store, and even though we shortlisted, or long listed actually, we had about 30 works that we put onto a long list, which then we developed a series of sessions with a mindful practitioner, and we went into our art store and had these pieces in the art store for people, because it was a very quiet, contemplative space. And Cathy Fortune, who is a mindful practitioner, created a series of sessions around these works. So some of them were mindful practices, some of them were looking at works in different ways. So she created these kind of apertures that would pick out specific parts of works. And then the final selection for the exhibitions actually was a result of the responses that the different groups had to those works. So there were some pieces that just didn't elicit that much response. And so we tried to choose the pieces that were that they had most response to, but also we really wanted to not think about a specific genre or media or time period. So there's everything in there from contemporary photography to 19th century seascapes. And we've got Barbara Hepworth Dove's sculpture in there at the moment. So it was really freeing because I didn't have to think about a theme to curate around in some respects, although saying that we had to start somewhere. So we did start with this kind of theme of immersion, which we felt was broad enough to encompass well-being, but also a kind of a collection of works. So they're the people that were involved. So it's quite a big team actually for quite a small space. I need to press a bit harder. Right. So, yes, so there's an example of some of the works that we have in there at the moment. And we did a split. So we did a kind of very much around landscapes and seascapes at one period. And now it's much more about interiors. So we've got some beautiful Gwen John pieces in there at the moment. I've just gone through that. Ooh, it is sticky. Can't move on. Oh, there we go. Right, so the gallery space itself, what was really freeing as well was this was kind of under the radar. So we didn't have very much money. It was in a relatively small space. We were kind of allowed to do what we wanted to do. So we decided to go for minimal works, try to create this atmosphere of calmness and comfort. We chose a kind of deep blue area, a deep blue colour for the walls. We had comfortable seating. We had works hung at a relatively low level so you could just sit and feel kind of slightly immersed by them. We cut back on interpretation, so there was just some very discreet vinyls with the artist, the media and the year, but then we did a booklet for people that wanted more information because we get told off a lot if there isn't enough information. And Louise created a series of audio meditations, and we worked with a company called Art Embark who were developing some software, and you could download these audio meditations on your phone, and there was a little map and things that went with them. And as part of that audio, Louise generated an introduction to mindfulness so that if you weren't aware of what it was, you could do a kind of short practice at the beginning, and then you could choose between 1 and 8 minute mindful practices with a particular artwork. So that's how the space looked initially. So as you can see, there's a real mix of kind of big abstract works, 19th century seascapes and photography. We've got IKEA sofas in there because that was our cheapest option, but also they just seem to work really well. So that's just kind of how the space looks without anyone in it. This is the kind of next iteration. So some of the works that because we did quite a lot of evaluation, and we noticed that there were certain works that people lingered in front of, stayed in front of for a very long time. So we kept a couple of those in, one of which was Albert Irvin's Untitled, which is the bright yellow painting you can see there, and Marcus Coates' Sea Mammal, which is the photograph with the kind of balloon head. And actually they were two of the works that the participants responded to most of all as well. So we've been collecting evaluation through comments cards, and the comments cards have prompts on there. So we ask people how long they've spent in there, how they feel when they went in and when they left. We also did some evaluation with somebody in the space with questionnaires who talked to people about how long they spent in there, what their feelings were about certain things, whether they did mindful practice in there or not. She took lots of observational evaluation of how long people stayed in front of particular works, how long they were in the space, whether they did any mindfulness or whether they just fell asleep, for instance. But we have created a kind of pie chart with the evaluation from the comments cards, the researcher that was in the space, and also from the audio downloads that we've had, because they can gather certain amounts of data for us as well. And what we found was a lot of people said that they lost track of time. So the other thing I must say about when we created the space, we created it so that there's the gallery that it is in is usually just a through space. We have a kind of horseshoe shape of galleries for the historic collections, and we had stuck a great big wall in front of the doorway so you couldn't just walk straight through. You had to kind of stop and look, and actually that has seemed to have made, so there's some really basic things that have seemed to have made a difference around seating, positioning of walls, all of that kind of thing. And it seems to have worked, and a lot of the feedback that we've had has been overall really positive. The negative feedback that we've had are people that have been annoyed when there are people talking in the space, so that it doesn't feel particularly mindful or peaceful. But actually we've had that quite a lot around the collections anyway, when we have school groups in and people aren't particularly happy about the noise and the disruption. So we've kind of got this sense that people like that kind of calm, fairly quiet quality altogether. We've also gathered quite a lot of feedback on social media, so there's a huge amount on Twitter and Instagram about the show itself, really nice sort of comments about how people have felt in the space as well. And for the future, we are going to be updating the space again later this year, and we're looking at working with various carers to select new works. And then longer term, we want to think about how some of the lessons we're learning from this will impact on the rest of the collections galleries, so that the whole building just has a sense of kind of, we might have kind of and breathe zones, for instance. I don't quite know yet, but one of the big things that came back from the research was sofas. Everybody loves sofas, and it makes such a difference for people's dwell time in the gallery. But we also do want to do some more in-depth research, because we're very aware that this was a kind of an experiment for us, really, and just looking at different ways of working with the collection. You asked earlier whether we might get there might be sort of various things that might trigger things. Now this, for me, this was one of the comment cards that we saw, that Louise and I just felt very strongly about including within the presentation, about somebody that obviously was struggling, came into the gallery, and it obviously had an impact on them. And there are various cards that say similar kind of things, and people coming back again and again. So that's me.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Fiona. We're going to move to a scientific perspective next. So I'm going to invite Rebekah to take us forward.
Yes, I feel a bit like an interloper here, but actually I think that makes two of us then. But actually I think what I'm going to talk about follows on really nicely from what Fiona was saying, and I can't get over having wing-backed armchairs in the gallery. I mean, how has no one thought of that before? I'm a lecturer at Goldsmiths in psychology, but I have a sort of an interdisciplinary background. I went to art school and then moved into psychology, and primarily became interested in the drawing process and what that says about how our visual systems work. And so I'm relatively new to the exploration of experiences in the gallery, but I happened to be invited to give a tour of the Pierre Bonnard exhibition that was recently put on at the Tate Modern, and just by chance the curator had said, Bonnard's work you need to slow down in front of it, it requires time, this kind of slow-looking approach. And this chimed in with a lot of the slow movement that's been picking up pace in the last decade or so, and it received quite a lot of attention. So they thought, well, we better put on some events in association with the exhibition to do with slow looking. So I gave a slow looking tour, and I just started off the tour by asking. So we were lucky enough for it to be a private tour, so we had the whole Bonnard exhibition to ourselves. There was about 40 people, and I invited them to pick a piece of art and spend about 5 minutes with the artwork, and afterwards we just had an open discussion about people's experiences. And I was completely taken aback by how intense some of the experiences were, and how different they were from I suppose what psychologists might interpret as the aesthetic experience or the art experience being. And I think that's because primarily in psychological studies where we're looking at people's responses to art, they're in a laboratory, in a university, they're looking at artworks for usually less than 10 seconds, sometimes only a couple of seconds. It really isn't something that we've approached as psychologists. So I find it fascinating because, there was just the range of responses was really interesting to me. So I became really interested in what slow looking is doing for the experience of art. And I suppose that links into mindfulness quite easily, because to be mindful, I think, is probably to slow down, or there's definitely an overlap there. So when I was thinking about what my position on mindfulness in the gallery is, I thought you could think about it in sort of two ways. And I suppose the trivial way is that we can bring mindfulness into the gallery. So we can do yoga, we can do meditation. It's this quiet, contemplative space, and that's all well and good. And we know that, so from a psychological perspective, we know that mindfulness is good for us. We know that it helps with things like anxiety and depression. It prevents rumination, sort of cycling through negative thoughts. So, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I think that's sort of a less interesting question, really. And what I'm really interested in through this experience of delivering the Slow Looking tour is using mindfulness as a way of opening up experiences with artworks and stimulating curiosity with artworks. And I know this isn't a sort of a new thing. I think it's probably as old as art itself, this idea that to connect with art, we need to slow down and be in the moment, and that a mindfulness experience of an artwork is an interaction between the artwork and the observer. And so I think that mindfulness in the gallery is good, but I think it's really about this connection through having different experiences with the artworks. Oops. And so I'm taking. I've got. So I was glad that Anne put up John Kabat-Zinn's interpretation of what mindfulness is, because that's something that sort of I've worked from. But I'm also psychological interpretations of what mindfulness is tend to sort of separate mindfulness into two facets, I suppose. And one of those is regulation of attention. So that's the being in the present moment aspect of mindfulness, this idea of kind of honing in on our experiences. Now, those might be sensory experiences, so interpreting what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're smelling, and what we're tasting, or they might be inward experiences, like so mindfulness meditation is often sort of functions around awareness of internal bodily states, for example, our breath. And then the other aspect of mindfulness that psychologists have sort of picked up on is this non-judgmental aspect, so this acceptance of our experience. And I think both probably can come into play quite strongly in our experiences in the gallery, but I'm sort of a bit more interested in this idea of regulation of attention, so the idea that mindfulness can really help us access this and focus on this sensory experience. And there's not much sort of empirical evidence out there to link experience of artworks with mindfulness, but there was a study that looked at what's called trait mindfulness, so that's the sense in which each individual might be able to harness mindfulness on a day-to-day basis. And there was a link between the tendency to have intense aesthetic experiences, which are usually characterized by being in front of an artwork or listening to a piece of music and feeling, getting the hairs on the back of your neck, or feeling like you might want to cry, these kind of really, we've all been there, we've had these intense experiences. And then that seems to be linked to a facet of mindfulness called the observing facet, which seems to tap into this idea of, people that are better able to connect with that sensory information seem to be more likely to have intense aesthetic experiences. So I think, we're starting to build up a little bit of evidence to suggest that mindfulness might be a way of accessing more powerful experiences with art. And I think the reason that mindfulness might do this is being able to focus our attention on the experience, and also, so in doing so, that allows us to sort of process more information about the experience, but also there's a sense in which in being mindful in front of a work of art, we're seeing or we're experiencing the information afresh. We're not placing our expectations or our previous experiences on that sensory experience. We're kind of treating it as if it was new. And I think, hopefully that resonates with a lot of people in terms of how that might foster a kind of more powerful aesthetic experience. Interestingly, I think a really important distinction to make is that this is quite different from a lot of forms of mindfulness meditation, in that a lot of mindfulness meditation doesn't focus on external experience. And I'm going to talk really briefly about some of things that might be going on in the brain when we're having these intense aesthetic experiences, and they actually seem to be quite different from what's happening when people are meditating. So there's an important distinction between focusing kind of internally and this idea of mindfulness as allowing thoughts to come in and responding to them non-judgmentally, and being in front of or experiencing some kind of artwork and focusing more on the experience and the feelings that the artwork is arising rather than what's happening internally. So I thought so this is Pierre Bonnard's work, which we focus on in my slow looking tour. And so to make this a bit more concrete, because I've talked about kind of definitions and the psychology behind it. But what I was really focusing on in my slow looking tour is that I think some artists, maybe not all artists, really provoke us to take this kind of mindful, slow approach. Because if we don't, we miss a lot of what is going on in the artwork. So for Bonnard, he was really, his use of colour, the way he kind of distorts the spatial relationships in the artwork, the fact that it's often really difficult to separate figure from ground in his paintings. All of these aspects of Bonnard's work is challenging our brains, essentially. It's challenging our visual systems. So our brains are really, really good at classifying things, placing meaning on them and moving on. That's what we do. And what art and the power of art, I think, is to challenge those systems. So we're not quite sure what we're looking at. We're not quite sure about the meaning. What was Bonnard trying to say? And I think by taking this kind of really focused, attentional approach, we're sitting with those ambiguities and we're fostering that curiosity. It's not about coming to a conclusion. It's about kind of sitting with the experience and allowing us to come to different interpretations. And I think that's where mindfulness could play a role in kind of getting more from the artworks. And this is certainly from the tour. What I picked up on was that people came to interpretations or had experiences with the longer viewing, the mindful viewing, that they would never have done if they just walked past it and said, well, that's a living room with someone looking through the window, which is what our visual systems do on the outside of the art gallery every day. We don't really care about these differences, but artists are really picking up on those. And finally, because I was asked to say a little bit about the brain, and I don't want to go too much into the detail, but I think there's something really interesting about art, and this was found a few years ago in a study where people were put in a brain scanner, and there was a group of participants. They were all asked to bring in works of art that really moved them, that they had this chill kind of sensation to, and they put every participant's images into a big set, and then every participant was shown everyone's chosen artwork. So what you have there is, in scientific terms, a really nice design, because for every one person there'll be one work or a few works that really move them, and they'll probably feel fairly indifferent to most of the works that are selected by the other participants. So here we're not really interested in what the artworks themselves do, it's about people's interaction with the artwork. And interestingly, what they found was, probably not surprisingly, parts of our brain that deal with visual information were really active, especially when we look at works of art that we really engage with. So we're just paying more attention, we're analysing the visual properties of that artwork more. But what is also interesting is this other network of regions called the default mode network were engaged. And these regions are usually engaged when the mind is wandering. So this network of network of regions was sort of, I want to say discovered, or at least the importance of these regions was discovered, I think about a decade ago, when people were just lying in the scanner supposedly doing nothing, but actually consistently these regions became active. And so there's a part of our brain that is really engaged when we're just thinking about nothing at all and not really focusing on the external world. But what's interesting is for the artworks that really move people, both of these regions are active. So where normally the visual system would kind of be quiet while the default mode network is activated, when we look at these really moving images, both are working in tandem, and that doesn't happen very often. So I think there's something really interesting going on when we're having these intense aesthetic experiences that are linking our sensory experience to our sense of self. And I don't know whether mindfulness is a way of kind of accessing that coupling. What's interesting is that in mindful meditators, so monks who have been meditating for many, many years, their default mode network is actually deactivated. So there's something different going on here, but I think it's really interesting because it really is, and it harks back to this distinction I think we need to make that. Mindfulness in the gallery, and this is what I really liked about And Breathe, although I didn't unfortunately get to go and see it, is that it really focuses on helping people to access the artworks, and that we shouldn't, that any mindfulness in the gallery should really be focused on helping people to maybe put their sensory experience and their relation to self at the forefront. And I think that's, that's
Great.
me.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebekah, for easing us gently into some of the realms within which she works and some of the introductory levels of complexity of what the mind and the brain, never mind the rest of us, might be up to at any given moment. And we're going to hand over to Michaela now, who's going to take us into the world of artistic practice and criticism with a few comments.
5 minutes seems like an awful long time when I was listening to the speakers, full of information. My 5 minutes is really a bit of a provocation, I suppose. So I'm being deliberately kind of challenging because I spent many, many years working in learning and interpretation within museums and galleries, and for 10 years now I've been working at the Bethlem Royal Hospital and at the Bethlem Gallery, and it's been a fascinating experience, but I'll go to the first slide, see if I can. Very poor slide, sorry, but for those of you who've been to the gallery, you might be familiar with these kind of sculptures that were at the gates to the Bethlem Hospital in the 17th century when it was on the Moorfield site, so it's raving and melancholy madness. And now they've been kind of like relocated to this beautiful admin building at the steps when you kind of walk up to the kind of museum. But they remind me every day that I'm at work that I'm working on a really contested site. There are so many kind of interpretations of art that are kind of like battling for pole position on a site like the Bethlem. There's a tendency for medical models to dominate, as you can imagine. The Bethlem Royal Hospital is a functioning hospital, it's a research hospital, it treats an enormous number of people every year. So when I first started working in the art studio at the Bethlem, I was really aware of what people's expectations of art practice were and how people's artworks were interpreted by other people and who felt they had the power and the authority to interpret somebody else's artwork. So it's kind of a really kind of complex kind of power dynamic. And so I always thought that my role was really to kind of like defend a place of resistance. For me, the art studio was a non-clinical space in a hospital where people could maybe articulate different senses of themselves, kind of be creative, form other kinds of subjectivities, and not just receive other people's interpretations. And so obviously I kind of ran into quite a few problems taking this particular approach, because I would have wonderful kind of psychiatrists. I had a fascinating discussion with one psychiatrist who said to me, I feel I have the right to interpret this artist's artwork because I've been his consultant now for 5 years. You know, so he wouldn't hold back in he kind of actually said saying what he thought the artwork meant. And I started to begin to wonder, what is this like for the artist, for the person making the art? Where is the space for them to articulate for themselves what they might be doing and to kind of gain some kind of agency in an environment where they're constantly being scrutinized and observed, and those processes are internalized. So for me, kind of the art studio and the art gallery are spaces where we can kind of challenge those really dominant modes of interpretation that kind of correspond to the way people kind of interpret themselves. This is not meant to be trivializing kind of like mindfulness, but very often when I was working in the art studio, people would come in with these adult colouring books, just kind of like wanting to kind of pass the time. And also, they were sometimes given tasks by their psychologists to kind of write the positive things in their lives, these kind of affirmations. And if you actually go into the wards in the hospital, there are kind of positive affirmations on the ward, and I was just on the walls, and I was just like thinking, if I run well, and fortunately I've never found myself, sectioned in a psychiatric hospital, but I was just thinking, if I run well, and I kind of walked into a ward space and saw this kind of image on the wall, I wondered if that would make me feel more unwell. This idea, this kind of relentless positivity, that somehow you're meant to kind of, feel these things, and if you're feeling really, really kind of unwell, how would it be to be confronted with these kind of positive mantras? I think that would probably make me feel, even more unwell. But so many people came into the art studio with these kind of mindfulness drawings, and part of them didn't want to say, why are you doing that? Because if people were obviously getting something out of it, just because they were off the ward. But the artist in me and the researcher in me thought, is there any way I can nudge this and make this into kind of like something else? And very often it was a stepping stone to familiarise people with the art studio, and then they would potentially begin perhaps to kind of experiment with forms that weren't kind of so didactic, I suppose. I've always been really worried when art is instrumentalized for something that is just seen as a good. So this whole kind of current debate around well-being in museums, it seems like it's really difficult to get any kind of critical purchase on the debate. You can't people just say, well, obviously it's a good thing that people go into museums and galleries and relax and are distracted from their everyday lives. But it seems to be to me that in a time when people really, in mental health in particular, it's a moment of crisis, and we're really at the sharp end of that crisis in the psychiatric hospital. And is kind of well-being activities in museums and galleries really the best way to go? Particularly because I think it can be a cheap form of therapy. I mean, it's kind of it kind of substitutes kind of state provision. It can be a way really of offloading the responsibility for getting better onto the individual. So this idea that you have a responsibility to make yourself well by visiting art galleries or for engaging in mindfulness activities. And I'm really much more interested in kind of art as an act of caring for yourself, but also caring for others. What about the social aspects of art? What about kind of art as an act of protest, art as an act of solidarity, all of those kinds of things that might be nudged out by this emphasis on people's personal responsibility to take care of their mental health. So I wanted to just show a couple of artworks really that we have in our collection, and just to think about kind of the ways we might access this work, the way that we, knowing nothing about the artist, perhaps might bring our understanding, what we think is actually going on in these particular works. This is a work by an artist called Daniel. And I suppose I kind of put it up with the kind of like mindfulness drawing, this idea that, you know, you could spend a lot of time doing these very intricate and elaborate drawings, and you could spend time, and that somehow that would be a way of self-regulating kind of like difficult emotions potentially. But actually, if you talk to the artist himself, it's an extraordinarily kind of a complex piece of work. He's actually challenging the spirit of some ancestor. There's a whole world that kind of underpins the production of these artworks, and he's really working within the tradition of visionary artists. But I was talking with a psychiatrist about these kinds of artworks that in a psychiatric hospital are often seen as a symptom of illness. So a psychiatrist might go, haha, yes, kind of psychosis, you know, or kind of delusions, psychotic delusions. But this one kind of consultant was just like saying, well, I'm not sure whether it's the symptom of an illness or it's a fantasy, a protective fantasy, that there's some kind of creative element. It's not a symptom of illness, it's some form of creative production that kind of is about him articulating himself and creating a subject within this extraordinarily complex world. And this is kind of Martin Wade, who I work with quite closely in the art studio. And once again, I mean, if you were interested in 20th century American abstraction, you might kind of see this painting in a particular kind of way. He was actually on the anxiety disorders unit and had very complex PTSD. And so the work for him was an attempt. He had a real problem with perfectionism. And so I was constantly kind of having a conversation with him to kind of like blur the edges of his lines and maybe kind of deliberately make a mistake. So for me, this kind of like work is about my relationship with him, sitting alongside him, maybe just trying to nudge him out of a particular mode of making. I just wanted to end with this particular provocation. So I was just thinking, what is the function of art and its institutions? And I'd just like to say, I don't think art is therapy, although there may be therapeutic outcomes as a byproduct of focusing on the art activity. But that only happens if you don't think of art as therapy. Hopefully about that a bit later. And I don't think the art gallery is a hospital, although we do provide care. So maybe I'd like to just think about what that care is, if it's not kind of the care that we might kind of communicate through wellbeing programs, because I think the kind of care, self-care, care of others, care as a form of resistance is perhaps something I'm much more interested in.
Thank you. Fantastic to have the provocation, fantastic to have such a fully engaged group of people. Well done, students, good choices. So what I'd like to do first is to ask the panellists whether they'd like to interrogate each other or respond or reflect in some way on what each other has said. So I'm going to suggest the same order unless you want to be very disruptive.
Can we be disruptive? Yes. I'm just taking in what Michaela's just said.
So mine's from Michaela, actually, and I think as I was listening to you, I think we actually agree on quite a lot of points, even though we're coming from very different perspectives. But what I've written down, I don't know whether this is articulated very well, but is mindfulness just another form of interpretation that we're placing? Like, I think we talked about this kind of didactic model of curation and museum education. Are we just doing? Do you think we're just doing the same thing with mindfulness? And does it have to be that way? Is there a way of integrating mindfulness that is not, I should feel this, I should be having this response to the artwork?
Yeah, I mean, I think mine's definitely a provocation, because obviously, I hope I'm much more kind of open-minded to different kind of approaches in the studio and in the gallery. But I think that didactic quality. So I was saying with my kind of fellow panelists before the talk, that I just wonder what happens when you kind of walk into a gallery and you don't experience the things you're supposed to experience. So I'm thinking about kind of, I don't know, in hospitals, there's a tendency to put the most innocuous images on the walls of the hospital, so you're not going to trigger any particular kind of response. So you get those hideous kind of nondescript, kind of, talking about IKEA, but but the IKEA paintings are all the same, like a flower of a painting or smiling children. And I'm just thinking, actually, you can never predict people's responses, surely. So somebody might kind of see a painting of a poppy, and through some strange, might be triggered by that. We don't know what people's experiences might be. So I think there's something about that kind of predicting, saying that the immersive experience is good, or saying that Bonnard, I can see why Bonnard, this kind of slow looking at the Bonnard, I think, but we've just recently curated an exhibition by Daniel Reagan, a photographer, at the Long Gallery at the Maudsley Hospital around suicide. And it's a really provocative exhibition, and we had to take an awful... We discussed, at length whether it was right to place those kinds of images in a hospital environment. But we fully got the backing of the psychiatrists and the Maudsley charity, because actually sometimes art isn't about kind of losing yourself. It's about finding yourself, or finding a different aspect of yourself. And we've had really positive responses to a very challenging kind of exhibition. So I think that's my issue, really. I think of that tendency to kind of create a comforting, ameliorative environment. It's really kind of like making a prediction how people are going to respond. What happens if you don't respond in that way? Because how will that make people feel if they don't gain that kind of experience?
Do I come? So I think one of the things, even though our starting point was thinking about immersion, but we purposefully just kind of chose very random artworks. And so the fact that you've got something like a Marcus Coates with the balloon head, which we were quite worried that would trigger certain kinds of responses, but alongside a very kind of immersive seascape, which is quite an easy thing to look at, was something that we felt quite strongly about. We didn't want it to be just pretty pictures on the wall that you could kind of lose yourself in. And I think the space we thought about, when I sort of said around cosy and comforting, it was more just about getting people to spend some time in there rather than just take a quick look and then walk straight through and do the whole looking at something for 17 seconds. And it is really tricky, because whatever, from a curatorial point of view, whatever you do, you're selecting works from the collection that is a fixed entity, but also we without sounding too defensive, I suppose, we did try to kind of put forward a selection to the people that helped us to choose the works that was as varied as kind of possible. But then there are other spaces within the building as well that will obviously have more challenging work. So I think that's the kind of beauty of somewhere like Manchester Art Gallery is. There's going to be something that you'll come across within the space that you'll have a completely different response to elsewhere. But you're right, we don't designate that as a kind of and breathe space. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to answer really kind of quite clearly and concisely.
And I just chip in to say that I don't actually think that mindfulness is antagonistic to the idea of challenging art. I think what I realised with Bonnard, a criticism of Bonnard is that he just makes pretty pictures, but the more, I didn't actually know that much about Bonnard before I got asked to do the talk, so learning more about Bonnard as I prepared for the talk, I realised that actually it is quite once I spent some time with the work, I was like, what is going on? I need to spend, these aren't just pretty pictures. And so I think, and maybe this, I haven't talked much about this kind of non-judgmental aspect of it, but I think that might be really useful, because if we can get away from this idea of I should be feeling this, or it's really, it's not good that I'm feeling challenged by this art, or that it's making me upset, or it's triggering. If we can enable people to sit with those experiences, I think that can be a positive thing. But I think the problem is that I think the wider perception of mindfulness is that I have to feel calm, and that's probably how it's being especially with its link to kind of meditation and yoga. We're definitely focusing much more on this idea of kind of tranquility and escape, but actually a big facet of mindfulness is taking in these negative experiences and thoughts and just allowing them to be, and not judging, not making a judgment on those thoughts and reactions per se. But I am worried about the idea that if someone stands in front of an artwork and can't do that, again they'll be judging them. It just feels like there's so much judgment when we enter the art gallery of ourselves and what we're doing with the art.
Who's judging though? That's what I'm not quite sure who's judging.
I think you need a certain amount of kind of cultural capital to be able to access those experiences in the first place and feel at ease exploring kind of any kind of emotions that kind of emerge in front of an artwork. In any case, I know it's a very particular kind of way of conceptualizing the encounter with the artwork, which has, you know, particular overtones, historic overtones for me, certainly. So I'm not sure. It feels a little bit kind of like didactic and kind of instrumentalizing, and also kind of, I don't know. It's this idea that it's this single solitary encounter with the artwork. It's that really kind of museums and galleries are social spaces. They're kind of spaces which have kind of like layers and layers of interpretation and judgment. I mean, I don't think you can avoid that. They're not neutral spaces by any kind of means, are they? And so this desire to make judgment, I think, is at the very, heart of what kind of how galleries, particularly in this country and in others, I'm sure, function. It's about taste. It's about
so many things, and it's so difficult for some people to get into the art gallery to start with, let alone have any experiences there. I wondered whether there was a conversation we could usefully have about the kind of skillfulness that is required in order to drop beyond that state of the simpler levels of a mindfulness program in a museum. And I'm aware also that there are differences, I think, between a gallery and a permanent collection institution. But if one's trying to, in a curatorial sense or through an artistic practice modality, to elicit a more or a less mediated response in some way by bringing people into a space in a different way. I was very struck by how you talked about the hang being different. Well, that's huge if you think about the way that curation has hung itself on a particular idea of doing that. So what I'm getting at is there a particular new kind of skillfulness that needs to come into play to get this to be a more critical practice that has legs, that might actually get us somewhere new? I wonder if anyone would speak to that. And there's another mic then, Rebekah, that's not being used.
I don't know.
I mean, for example, you're an art and design curator, Fiona, aren't you? So that's interesting.
Right. And so I don't quite understand. So.
Well, I'm just thinking, what are the implications for curatorial skills, for curatorial training, for students like we train here and in other places? What do we need to be thinking about if we're going to be unpacking, as we have done in theoretical terms for a long time, the controlling space of the art gallery, the controlling architecture of the museum, the practices that we fall into without noticing that they're actually really problematic and lack a critical apparatus sometimes within the museum. So, what do we need to do as curators or people making interventions in these spaces that's different? So does that help? I don't know if it does.
It's such a massive question, and we were talking earlier about how a lot of what a lot of what we're talking about today around art and well-being and terms like mindfulness has suddenly become a funder's dream, I suppose. Yes. Yeah. And I've worked within Manchester Art Gallery for quite a number of years, and certainly felt that you're kind of responding to different agendas. Whether it be a directorial agenda, a government agenda. So, I've been through everything like Renaissance in the regions, where it was all about regional museums and galleries and accessing national collections. And now there's a very kind of strong focus on art and well-being, and there's a big pool of funding around art and well-being. So, but then that could very well shift again. And I think, as I said earlier, that I felt that certainly within Manchester Art Gallery's case, and from my own perspective, there's a kind of given that some people do find museums and galleries a kind of place of solace, and somewhere that, particularly if they're free and open and have a huge kind of range of different types of work that you can go and see. So I used to work in visitor services at the gallery when I was doing my degree in Manchester, and observed a lot of people that were ill and were just coming into the gallery as a place to kind of sit and take time and get out of the rain, and we would have sort of regular conversations with people that came in on a daily basis that were just quite pleased that there was something else, that they could kind of come in and feel that they weren't going to be asked to leave, that they had somewhere to kind of sit, and whether it was just looking at an artwork or not looking at an artwork. So I suppose I'm kind of approaching it from that point of view. In my time in museums and galleries, I've kind of felt that as a local authority gallery, that's kind of one of the reasons that we're there. We're funded by by Manchester City Council. We're now very strongly connected with local health services as well, and we've got this collection that belongs to the City of Manchester. So I'm just very keen that collection is as a curator, I can't seem to get away from this didacticism. So it's kind of, looking at different kind of experimental approaches, I think, and being given the freedom as a curator, I suppose, to just be able to work with collections in different ways, but also with living artists and working with contemporary shows that offer very kind of different approaches. And at the moment we've got a show that's all about called Get Together and Get Things Done, which is very much about agency and power and activism. So I don't know whether that helps, but I think, I don't know whether that helps. Sorry, I don't feel like I can give a really kind of...
No, I think that is really interesting, because I feel as though we're playing somewhere around, somewhere between the kind of coercive nature of funders and regulatory bodies and all of those apparatuses, and the sort of sense of disruption and resistance. So that I think it's interesting to bring those into play. Do you two want to say anything here?
I keep on thinking about kind of certain projects that I've been involved with. I worked I evaluated the communal knowledge programme at the Showroom Gallery for a long time, and there was a fascinating project called The Invisible Spaces of Parenthood by Andrea Franco, and it started as an exhibition that she did for her MA, where she was protesting against the closure of the creche in the art school, and because many of her fellow students weren't actually parents, they didn't care that the creche was closed. But for her, as a single parent, it was kind of really key that she had that kind of provision. It allowed her to study and to kind of carry on. So she was invited to do a kind of Invisible Spaces of Parenthood Mark II out of Chelsea in the art school in her MA exhibition. She was invited to do it at the Showroom Gallery, which is kind of in a particular area of off Edgware Road, particular area of London, kind of fascinating kind of space. And she found that when she kind of she just set about staging a creche as an artwork, as an art exhibition in the Showroom Gallery, and many of the people in the local area said, you can't do that because the state provision of nursery provision has been shut down in the local area. So you're providing a free service that is kind of supplanting kind of state provision. So politically and ethically, that's a huge problem, because people will come and kind of leave your kids here in this artwork nursery, and you know, the state will no longer have to provide nursery services for the rest of the year when the project is closed down. And it really made me think about kind of when we instrumentalise, you know, art institutions, that sometimes we're putting a sticking plaster onto some, you know, really kind of, you know, difficult situations, and that we're kind of giving people, we're giving an excuse for those services not to be made available all year round outside of the art institution. So Andrea Franken was really kind of, she immediately responded to this, because obviously when you shift the context of a project, it changes immediately. And so she made it into much more of, it was wonderful, kind of like a critical display, a kind of a resource centre for kind of, you know, DIY aesthetic, 1970s make your own furniture, and kind of ran kind of DIY workshops for kind of like parents with their children to kind of create their own spaces. So she made it into a resource that was kind of available rather than just kind of like replicating the creche. So I often think kind of like curatorially, you know, and kind of artistically, we have a responsibility to be sensitive to context and to think about kind of when you're offering these kind of services as part of a program within a museum or gallery, you know, how is it working in relation to other services? Is it kind of a sticking plaster over a kind of a chasm, an impossible situation? Is it kind of supplanting other kind of more effective treatments? You know, we really have to kind of, I think, curatorially think about kind of the context in which we are working, and how, you know, kind of the, you know, funders might be kind of pushing us in a direction that's actually doing more harm than good in the long term.
Rebekah, did you want to say anything there?
No, I think I completely agree with you. I think that, and this, I'm not really speaking as a psychologist here, but I think, you know, one of the primary functions of art galleries is to disrupt and raise awareness of those issues, not to. And it does. And I guess this was the discomfort I sort of talked about in my first slide, was that I feel like we're just putting these very simplistic ideas around well-being into the gallery space without any sense of the context. There's no, you know, I'm sure there is a way that yoga could be successfully integrated into the gallery, but it isn't clear on the surface how that could be done. And so it's just it's almost like the art gallery is just a box to put these activities in, and I think but I think where it's done really well, it's a conversation between the visitors and the artworks, and as I said, I think the main route that I think is interesting is just using, you know, what areas around, and maybe not even well-being, but what areas around these issues help people to access the works in a different way. So I guess, you know, using it as a disruptor to say, your expectation is that you probably need to experience the artwork in this way, try this other way, and see if it works and see if it elicits something different. So I think that's, it's sort of, the opposite to what I think the funders think should be happening, and they probably get upset when it's not, you know. And I think I said when we were discussing before the panel that one of the discomforts I have as a scientist is that when I collaborate with artists or curators, my worry is always that I'm sort of being used to help instrumentalize the institution. And I think I'm much more interested in the kind of the phenomenology of the experience in the art gallery, more so than than the consequences for well-being. So I can't, and I haven't really found out enough yet to be able to say what. But I think any curatorial practice that can help disrupt in the way that artists do, in the way that an artist will disrupt our normal way of experiencing the world, our normal way of thinking about the circumstances that we're in. I think curators can work with artists to feed into that. And it interests me that just the placement of a wall or the addition of an IKEA sofa has a massive impact on the way that people. So it seems to suggest that there are very simple ways that we can disrupt, perhaps the flow through an exhibition, or or the deliberately not picking a theme, and so having works that contrast with each other. These themes, I mean, I think this is being done in a lot of galleries, but it seems almost quite radical to do these things, and
taking
they're
the
so
labels away.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
I think it's important to say as well, though, that, I mean, you're right. You have to think quite carefully about how this works, and that you're not a sticking plaster, and you're not just replacing a service that somebody wants to fund from a different pot or something like that. And I think, I mean, I can only speak for the projects that we've done, but we've been doing them in collaboration with the NHS Trust and the Whitworth and the Manchester Museum of doing different projects as well. So we're trying, between the three of the venues that are the sort of Manchester partnership, we're trying to look at different areas of need that the Health Trust are telling us about. So it's that fine balance between the gallery being able to offer some kind of service that's part of a need that's already out there, and we're not kind of replacing something. But from our point of view as well, I suppose the other difficulty is all sorts of people. We've got 650,000 people a year coming through the building, some of whom will be interested in wellbeing and mindfulness, some of whom won't. So the other balance that we had to think about within this space and all the other stuff that we do is how will something have a much wider appeal if you don't want to sit there and be mindful, or So I think that I probably haven't articulated that very well, but I suppose that did come into our thinking when we were thinking about the shaping of that space as well, and putting things like James' case spear photographs, which are quite unsettling and could elicit lots of different responses. And so I think, I think there's still a lot of work to do, but I think it still has kind of value as well.
And, it will be interesting, I think, to look for models of good practice here as the debate goes on. Can I open up to the audience now to see whether people have questions? Do we have a roving mic? I should have checked earlier on. Can you speak nice and clearly? Please do. Thank you.
What strikes me is kind of the idea that the mindfulness and calm, and how they're not, I don't think that they're the same thing. Like the idea of well-being and needing to be calm. Mental health is so much broader, it's just huge and really complicated. And the idea, I think, I definitely agree with you in the sense that you can't stick a plaster on something. You can't say, we're going to do a mindfulness program, and it's the idea of making an institution into a tool to service a particular need that the government should be doing, or the health service should be picking up on, is quite problematic. What I did wonder is, because the mindfulness practices that you have talked about in your kind of gallery spaces, your own practices, have been quite visually hierarchical, and what provision there could be for people who don't necessarily are, visually impaired and blind, and how we can afford to make gallery spaces accessible more broadly, so that the idea of mindfulness doesn't necessarily rely on the need for vision, for you to be able to engage in that practice, and how, if an art gallery could possibly be entirely accessible in any kind of behaviour, kind of okay in that space, like talking about, I work in the schools and teachers team at TAPE, and one of our things is kind of disrupting the gallery so that students can be noisy and can have fun and can kind of play. And I really picked up on that idea of the sort of juxtaposition between a space being mindful and peaceful and quiet, and then people being like, oh, there's this school booth. Really problematic. And one of the things that we try to do consistently is challenge our audiences to kind of say that actually it's okay for them to be in this space too. And it's about that difference and the kind of the dynamic that you have when you interact with artworks, and the value of that individual experience.
Who would like to take the question? All or any?
I could say something. Yeah. And I think, we work with a really good audio describer called Anne Hornsby and do lots of sessions with her, with people with visual impairments. So we are trying to be as accessible as we possibly can. But I mean, that was a kind of throwaway comment around, but people do say to our visitor services team, why is it so noisy? Because we've got school children in all the time and we like to disrupt, and, you know, we're not a kind of a hush space at all. And I think the Unbreathed project was something that we wanted to experiment with as a kind of team within the gallery, and just see if there were ways of connecting up the work that Louise had been doing with the collection that would mean if there were people that did want some form of space that they felt was an escape, or they couldn't come to a mindfulness session or a take notice session or something like that, there was something there. That's not to say that space is deathly quiet the whole time and you know, really kind of calm. So for instance, tomorrow night we've got a group of young people from Contact Theatre kind of coming in and doing a series of performances over the next week or so, and they're putting a projection up in that space, and it will just feel completely different again. So it's from our perspective, it is a kind of experiment, and we're trying to do it as carefully as we possibly can. And then we also work with volunteers for wellbeing. So we work with volunteers that approach us, that want to work with us at the gallery, and they have taken up that space in terms of doing sort of tours and sessions in there as well. So there seems to be something that they've connected to with that space.
Okay, right.
Yeah, just kind of, many years ago I used to work with, I was community curator at Take Liverpool, and I used to work with a visual impairment advisory group, and they were extraordinarily militant. And I'm just thinking about this idea, what your question kind of brought to my mind is that we think that institutions kind of offer a service, but actually the people in the visual, this advisory group were demanding a space. It wasn't this idea of kind of, you know, the art gallery, you know, offering a service, you know, the cultural offer. It was much more about kind of a particular temporary community of people demanding representation within the institution and demanding a space. And I think that's something about this idea of kind of like well-being, when, you know, who are we to kind of, you know, offer this kind of, you know, space and to kind of determine and kind of preempt what that space will look like and what artworks will kind of create those kinds of responses. When people's responses are so unpredictable, it's really much more about, I think, kind of like dialogue with people rather than delivery, this idea of kind of, a delivery
more
model.
about co-creation, perhaps, ultimately. Is there anyone else in the audience? I see a hand there, and then over here. Go ahead.
I just wondered if you could say a bit more about, you mentioned gallery labels and sort of more traditional interpretation material. I was thinking about a lot of mindfulness practice being about coming sort of out of our heads and our chatter and perhaps into our senses. So what's the role of that sort of curatorial content or written interpretation material, for example, or knowledge, so curatorial expertise in within mindfulness-based practices?
Thank you. Would you like to speak to that, Fiona, to start with?
I could, yeah. We kind of made a decision not to put any interpretation, just some kind of basic information about what we were trying to do with that space. But then we were getting quite a bit of feedback through our visitor services team on the ground that there was a certain amount of chatter from various visitors that wanted more information about the artworks that were on display. So we kind of created a booklet that they could choose to pick up and look at if they wanted to, and find out, I suppose, more of a kind of traditional narrative around the painting. And then Louise's audio kind of meditations were much kind of freer and broader. So again, it's a kind of it's a tricky thing to know how to get it right, and all you can really do is kind of try something see what what responses that might elicit, and work around that.
Thank you. I think I'll take one more question from the audience. I saw a hand over here.
So I work at the National Gallery. I programme events, courses and events, and over the last 4 or 5 years, we've put on quite a number of mindfulness and art events coming from all sorts of different angles. We've had drawing events, which Carly over here has led, about letting go of your judgment when you're drawing, about being in the moment with the pigments and the materials. We've done, just recently we did a drawing course that was about being alert to the judgments and bias that we have when we look at bodies and beauty. So we had really diverse models, and so it was using meditations to spark conversation. But we've done lots of slow-looking, guided, sort of sensory immersion into paintings, and we've done things that have been quite a bit like the mindful mark, sort of kind of regular, fairly simple events to put on, and then we've put on very sort of high-priced, tailored events that have had an enormous amount of work and thinking going into them, with lots of different carefully thought-out activities. But the problem I have really is that it's unlike Manchester. It's not top-down support. It's me as a programmer putting these things on and then trying to buy in support and struggling from above. And I wondered whether any, I think your institutions are kind of different, but maybe Tate is perhaps the closest, whether you've sort of been through that. Maybe Manchester had to go through that in the very early days of becoming the Mindful Museum. How do you kind of make the case internally, and also just kind of make more of a splash about what you're doing? You had great press about the Bonnard exhibition.
Rebekah, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I suppose. Well, I guess because I don't feel like I have any expertise in telling institutions how they should be doing things. But I suppose from the perspective of what interests me as a psychologist and I like it when, or actually just as a consumer of art, going to art exhibitions, I like it when the content poses a question that can lead to lots of interpretations and allow me to kind of explore that space. I don't like it when I feel like everything is channeling into one interpretation. But I think, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, that the prevailing model around the way that institutions function is this kind of, we're leading you to a conclusion. And I think, as a member of the public visiting art galleries, I think that assumption still prevails with the visitors, and I think this is why people beg for those more kind of traditional interpretations. And actually, this was a question I was going to ask. I guess I could ask the panel: is to what extent do you just give the visitors what they want? And to what extent do you risk maybe being a bit didactic and saying, we'll give you something that's a bit challenging and that we might get kickback on, but as experts, as people who've been curating and working with institutions for decades, we have a good sense that this is going to lead to an enriched experience. So I think that's the difficulty with there are some people who perhaps have spent more time thinking about how people consume art. So yeah, to what extent do you kind of bow to the pressure of funders and the public, and to what extent do you say actually we'll do things differently? And I think that probably speaks to that within these big institutions. There's still a resistance against doing things differently.
We need to wrap up very shortly, so I think I should offer Michaela a really brief last word, if she'd like it, in response to Rebekah's provocation. I can always carry on over to
it. I was just thinking, as you were speaking, I just think, particularly at Bethlem, my allegiance is always to the artist, because they work in such kind of constrained situations. So I think any wriggle room I can provide by showing their work in different contexts and kind of giving them space where they're not kind of interpreted by the same model over and over again, hopefully will model to the visitor that same capacity, that same potential to actually explore different subjectivities through art practice, but also through the encounter with the artwork. So it's really about kind of thinking about how artists are pigeonholed, particularly if they produce work in healthcare settings, and how they can be so quickly labelled that it kind of prevents them from exploring different aspects of themselves. And so that's probably my last one.
Thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Anna, but I'd like everyone to join me in thanking our panellists for carrying on our conversation.